Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great joy to have you here this evening and to see members from across the university and the different faculties. As you know, we take seriously inaugural lectures of our new professors, and we do this. We don't do it lightly because we appoint our professors carefully, and when they are appointed, we gather to celebrate these new appointments. Tonight I want to welcome you to a very special inaugural lecture because Professor David Bolt, as you will hear, is one of us, has been with us for over 10 years and has now achieved a personal chair and will give his lecture to us in a few moments. May I use this opportunity to also welcome his parents who are here. Very welcome. It's always nice to have the family, and I gather other members of the family are here too, and you're all very, very welcome. These are family celebrations as well as the Hope family celebrating tonight. Two other special guests, if I may mention, is the Bishop of Belfast. Bishop Traynor is with us, who's just made it to Liverpool, and the principal of St. Mary's College, Professor Finn, is with us, Professor Peter Finn. They've come to talk to the university about how we can work together. It's a special delight to have you, Bishop, and Professor Finn. And so if I may do what Professor Newport would have done if he were here, he's on his way to Dubai at the moment, and I'm doing the Pro-Vice Chancellor Academics role today. Thank you, Eileen, for Professor Newport's notes. It's a great pleasure then to introduce Professor David Bolt. And often, as I said, when I introduce our inaugural lectures, I'm normally introducing fairly new colleagues. But David has been with us now for almost 10 years. And through his distinguished academic standing, has been promoted to a personal chair. Professor Bolt began his academic career with the attainment of a first-class degree in literary studies at the University of Staffordshire. It was a mark of future success that even at this early stage of his career, he was awarded a prize for academic excellence. Professor Bolt then went on to complete his PhD studies with the recognition provided by the Arts and Humanities Research Council through an award of a PhD scholarship. Having achieved his PhD, Dr. Bolt began his own project in launching a new journal, which has now become a distinguished journal, the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, published by the University of Liverpool. He also held a research fellowship at the University of Lancaster before coming to us. And here he was appointed first lecturer and soon after made the director of the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies. He was quick to make his mark in the establishment of a master's degree in disability studies, which began in 2013. And many of the students who have gone through the course are in fact graduates from this university. In 2014, Professor Bolt was listed in the top 10 of the most influential academics with a disability in the UK. And you can see that the list that he was top 10 of was headed by no other than Professor Stephen Hawking. And you will recognize the kind of company our distinguished professor is keeping. He's a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and perhaps even more importantly, his expertise in learning and teaching was recognized by his own students when he won the Student Prize for Teaching. Professor Bolt is the author of many publications. Indeed, altogether his publications number some 55 books and journal contributions. These include Cultural Disability Studies in Education, Interdisciplinary Navigations of the Normative Divide, published by Routledge in 2018, and The Meta-Narrative of Blindness, a rereading of 20th century Anglophone writing, published in 2014. Although it would not be appropriate to go into detail, informed by expert advice by some of the highest academics in the field, the university is confident that Professor Bowles' work will feature significantly in the upcoming Research Excellence Framework, and that among his publications there is a high percentage of work classed as 4-star, which means world-leading. As a scholar, therefore, Dr. Bowles' profile is unquestionable. Within the university, he is known also as an academic, and this I find particularly endearing to the university. He always finds time to support less experienced members of staff as they begin their own careers in publishing. Professor Newport, as I said, would regret that he's not able to be here this evening, has highlighted his contribution to the establishment of the Early Careers Researcher Framework, which he and his colleagues have contributed to greatly. And this is, again, designed to help new researchers in the field. Professor Bowles also has the ability and the network to bring together high-ranking scholars from across the world. And this is seen in his annual conferences that he hosts at the university. And scholars have come to this university from the Far East, North America, and Australasia because of his global reach. He is also a frequent commentator on disability-related matters in the media, including Radio 4's In Touch program and The World at One. He has supervised many research students, and one of those students came to us from abroad, who came specifically to be able to work under him because of the standing he has in the field. And so, as a scholar and a friend and a valued member of this community, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to introduce you to Professor Bowles, whose lecture this evening is From Avoidance to Appreciation, the Cultural and Social Values of Disability Studies and Interdisciplinarity. Professor Bowles.
Okay, thank you, folks. Thank you very much, and thanks, Vice-Chancellor. Thanks to everybody who's come. I'm lucky to have my family here, my colleagues who are, of course, now my friends, and students, and various visitors, and so on. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to start, actually, by giving a tiny bit of biographical background. A bit of fun, really, but just to frame it. But I think what is essential, just because I might get a bit carried away as we go through the session, I just want to do what I think is the most important thing, and that's just to thank Amy Scott for organising this at relatively short notice, and she's been positive all along, and I think everyone will agree that she's done a brilliant job. So can you show your appreciation before we crack on? Okay, thank you. And I'll also thank my support worker here, Holly, who's going to be helping me tonight. She's been helping me along the way. And my various colleagues, most notably perhaps my manager, Claire Penketh, but all of my colleagues who are here. You know, today is quite a funny day. It's a one-off experience, isn't it, to become, to inaugurate that professorship. It was nice when I got the letter saying I got it, but it's a real celebration today, as Ella and Erin have not let me forget with what they've been calling the David Bolt Day from breakfast this morning, when they both came in and gave me gifts in the office, which was very touching. And then I opened an email from a colleague, Owen, telling his students to come along to this fantastic session and all this stuff, lovely stuff. And then, of course, I went to the session at 1 o'clock that Claire did, where she seems to know my work much better than I do, which is a little bit worrying. But it was a lovely way to sort of move up towards this. Of course, you know, there are loads of people I really ought to be thanking throughout this, but I should crack on, and I just want you to know, obviously, that those thanks are extended to everyone here. Forgive me if I don't mention anyone's name, but we will move on. Okay, then, so if we move on to the first slide, this is, as I say, in that biographical mode. So, born in Cardiff, raised in Newcastle-under-Lyme, and made in Liverpool. So I've got to say born in Cardiff to keep my dad happy, because he was born in Cardiff too, and I'll say his father before him, but that's not strictly true. I think that's Swansea. But for argument's sake, you know where I'm going with this. My mum's side of the family from Newcastle-under-Lyme, which is where I've lived for decades, actually, before I came here. You know, pretty proud of being Welsh. Not as proud as my dad is of being Welsh, but, you know, I am proud of being Welsh. But I'm also proud that I lived in Newcastle-under-Lyme for a long time, made lots of really good friends that I still go and have a pint with now, who I started drinking with in doorways when we were 13 or something. Obviously, that's not for the Vice-Chancellor, but for the rest of us, I think you know what I'm saying. You know, I still go back and have a pint with them, but inside a pub, which is much, much better. You know, I also, I'm glad that I lived in Newcastle-under-Lyme, because that's where my brother came along, who is here as well today. And also my daughter. My daughter's here with her partner, you know, my daughter was born when I was about 24. So it seems like she's always been around. You know, I'm very grateful for that. So I just wanted to mention some of those things. While we're in that vein, I guess I've talked a little bit there about, you know, Cardiff and Newcastle-under-Lyme very briefly. But the connection with Liverpool is not the most obvious one, actually, because when I started the journal, that's when I at first had the connection with Liverpool. Before I came to Liverpool Hope, I got a contract, you know, many years ago, actually, for the journal. And then so when I saw the job possibility at Liverpool Hope, it was more of a coincidence that I was heading towards Liverpool, as it were. But needless to say, you know, the vast majority of my achievements have been here at this university by far. So, you know, I thank you all for that. I was long-term unemployed before I came to this university. Some of the things the Vice-Chancellor has talked about in the past, about his life in apartheid, South Africa and so on, that are very moving to us all. And, you know, I can't help but think of my own story in a smaller way. Obviously, we're not talking about such an international thing as the Vice-Chancellor's talked about, but I won't be the first disabled person who found great difficulty in finding a job. When I got my first job, I'd already got my own journal. And I call it my own journal. I started it. Obviously, it would be nothing without colleagues. So that's the sort of thing I will be talking about in this session. Disability means many things, but that is one of them. And I want that to be on the record, as it were. Well, I'm talking about that point. Positionality is very important in the field that I work in, and the field that many of you work in. So I'm saying that up front, aren't I, that I'm a disabled person. You know, I was born with a visual impairment, probably. Certainly, it became apparent in my childhood. And then it was diagnosed when I was 18. I was registered blind at 18. And then I had a physical impairment that became apparent when I was in my 20s. And that was diagnosed when I was in my 40s, because I didn't used to go to the doctors. And so on. And so, you know, that's my lived experience. But here in the academy, I should stress, this is what fuels my work. This is what fuels those concepts that I name, those theories that I put forward, the representations that my approach to those representations, the way I criticize those representations, and indeed the way I try to share opportunities and just offer enthusiasm for the work of my colleagues, because sometimes that's all it takes. You know, a colleague will come to you in your office and they've got all the ideas, and all you really need to do is just, you know, show them that someone gives a shit about the work, and they're right there. They're firing off, you know, and that's all it takes. And that's what often the mentor sessions actually entail, just being really genuinely interested in the work of colleagues. The great work of many colleagues here. Okay then, so if we can move on a little bit. Okay then, so this is a nice photo, isn't it? My mum and dad are puzzled because they don't even understand how these things can be put on these slides. Also, because so people can recognise these two. Yeah. They've changed a bit. These film stars on the image have been converted into these people who are now my family, as it were, and that's them at their honeymoon. Yeah. So, which is quite funny because every picture of them on their honeymoon is of them as individuals. Because they're so shy, they wouldn't ask a passerby, can you take a photo of us together? So I've got to believe that they went together and they are really married, I've got to believe that, but we've got no evidence apart from, not in that photo of them anyway. So I'm, I know that I'm lucky to have my mum and dad here, so I just wanted to show that photo just to make sure they're read as they need to be, as it were. Okay, so fair dues. Let's move on. We've got another photo that probably is even more of a contrast. I show this photo sometimes to the students if they're lagging a little bit, and they are completely horrified by what can happen to someone in their life. They see this person in front of them, i.e. me, and then they see the guy on here. Can you see which one I am? Which one I am? Everyone recognise the one with the big blonde hair? You know what I mean? It's like they are so horrified, it's upsetting for me. But, I do make the point, well, if you look at yourselves now, you're very beautiful. I was then. There is a logic here, isn't there? And you get some, that's when philosophy comes into play, But just to prove that I was really there with this band, this was a band called Life, so it was, my early days were in punk rock, and then we moved into what you might call pop, punk pop, or when I show Holly this photograph, I think she thinks we were a punk band, but it's the leather trousers that always throws everyone. I'm still trying to get colleagues now to wear leather, and I was then, and you can see that no one listened and no one listens. But can we just have a quick burst there, Holly? So this is way back when. I wrote this when I was 17, and I think I'm 18 or 19 and this is a live recording, so it's poor quality. Oh, the music's loud, that's him. I see me meeting on your crowd, asking why in every breath. Maybe life is all control all the time I'm seeing her. So that's a quick sample from YouTube. Holly's had the job of putting a lot of my old music on YouTube, which has been hilarious. But just for the record, at that gig, my mum and dad were there, as was my brother. My mum and dad were allowed to come, some of them, but they had to sit at the back because we were, essentially punk, They're allowed to sit at the front today, all is fine now. But I feel a little bit disappointed that Nisha wasn't there. I feel like she let me down, but of course she hadn't been born at that stage. Okay then, we better crack on. Is it the other? Yeah, so I've mentioned punk rock along the way a little bit here. I do need to speed up now a little bit, so I hope this is okay. But there's this quote, and my disability studies MA students often find this, and of course I'm familiar with it from way back when I left school. And it's this idea that, you can read my body, but you never read my books. So just think about that quote. This Ian Jury is a disabled punk icon, sadly no longer with us, but he was, if you like, proud to be disabled. And again, that sort of fed into his punk rock career, because he was othered by disability, and punk rock celebrated that, So think about that quote a little bit, because I use a term in my work, critical avoidance, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But I think in many ways that's a good illustration of this, because you can read my body. I mean, the thing is, disabled people are looked upon, gazed upon, with some persistence, and yet credit, recognition, that comes with reluctance. And I think that's captured in this quote, which I'll come back to later on. That idea that people have lots to say about such and such being disabled. Not so quick to go and read the books, though. I often talk to my new students about this, what have you been told about me and so on, what have you heard, sort of thing. And the books tend to be pretty low in the things they've heard about me, which is interesting. And of course, my ego can just about take it, but let's move on. Okay, so anyone who's ever been to any of my sessions or even talked to me for more than about half an hour will know that I always come back to this model of prejudicial behaviour. 65 years old it is, and I started to use it when I was in my second year undergraduate, and still evidently feel that it's useful. One of the things, I'll just talk through this very quickly. So it's a five-part model, as I said, and it moves from anti-locution, which is on the level of language, essentially, right the way up to the worst possible prejudicial behaviour, which is extermination. So we move from anti-locution to avoidance, to discrimination, to physical attack, to extermination. So one of the things that struck me straight away is that where avoidance is. So avoidance is higher up than the sort of, if you like, bad-mouthing of people. And that caught my attention when I first came across this work, which is, as I say, classic psychosociology or socio-psychology, depending which way you want to take it. I want to keep coming back to this throughout the session because I think that word avoidance then is really important to underscore in terms of prejudicial behaviour, because avoidance can sometimes seem so passive that it's not aggressive, if you like. Well, according to this, it is part of those behaviours. What I'll say very quickly then is that looking at this model, Allport's point was not that if you engage in those less extreme levels, not if you engage with those levels, do you then, quotes, progress to the higher levels, but that they have to be in place, the lower levels have to be in place for the higher levels to happen. I'm not doing a brilliant job of explaining that. I could do with opening it up a little bit, but if you'll just take that for the time being, and I'll try to open it up a little bit later. Yeah, okay, so I just want to now think about that term then, critical avoidance, and what I might mean by that. When representation is considered in the academy, especially in the humanities, but not just in the humanities, disability is widely represented, widely included. There's lots of representations about disability that we and our colleagues will consider in the academy. And that's been the case for a long time. It's often been misrepresented as it goes, but that is the case. If you look through the materials, disability is always there. It might not be shouting out, you might not be that explicit, but it is there. Unfortunately, and lots of you will know exactly what I'm going to say now, the critical responses are not there. So every good university will have a copy of Jane Eyre, but they won't necessarily have the critical responses that are informed by disability studies. And that's been the case for a long time. Things are better now than they were, but that's what I mean by critical avoidance. So the representations are there, but the responses are not. So, of course, what happens is people start to talk about, let's say, Jane Eyre or whatever it might be, Ulysses, and all the books are available, but they are not drawing on disability studies. They're not drawing on something that's informed by that discipline. And the point about disability studies, as you see right now, and as you've already gathered from what I've talked about my background, is it's led by disabled people. And if not disabled people, then people who have good experience of disability. And what I mean by that, people, family members and so on who are disabled. That's, in the vast majority, those are the people who lead the field. So obviously it's a profoundly informed discipline. And that's often what's lacking in the academy, still, alas. As I say, much better now than it was, but this that I want to just think about now then is the meta-narrative of blindness, which was my first effort at addressing that critical avoidance. So lots of literature, represents blindness. I found that when I was at university myself, in undergraduate years. But I did notice that we weren't drawing on this thing that might be called disability studies. It really wasn't, it didn't have a presence. So I did my PhD, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned. And then some 10 years later, I eventually got this book published. It's not the PhD, it's a distant relative. And I'm glad it took that long, because it became something better than it would have been. It's a fair contribution to the field now, and it wouldn't have been before, not really. It would have been a PhD, full stop. And so that was where I started in terms of this, and I was lucky to get this in a really important series, the Corporeality series, which is published by the University of Michigan. Okay, let's keep moving. I want to just pause on the content a tiny bit here, and this idea that I put forward that in the meta-narrative of blindness. And this is the idea that I drew from someone called Rosemary Garland Thompson, for those of you who are not familiar with her work. But she talks about the social encounter and about awkwardness in corridors and so on, and when a disabled person meets a non-disabled person, what happens there. And she says that in those moments, that person, that disabled person, becomes reduced to just their disability. So the complex person becomes reduced to just this one quality or this one aspect of identity. That's what Rosemary Garland Thompson said. I expanded on that. I thought that makes sense, but there's something more that goes on here, according to my experience, and that's that there seems to be something that is brought to the table as well, what I called then, a sort of a cloud of a narrative under which disabled people find themselves existing, as it were. So in those encounters, the person is reduced to disability, but then that very disability, or that impairment, depending on how we're looking at this, keys that person to a whole range of stereotypes, universals, tropes, and so on about disability. Something happens. So they don't come with their own, if you like, micro-narrative, but they become connected to a meta-narrative. So that's something I just want to park there, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, let's move on. So you'll see now that I'm going to be focusing very much on book-length projects. That's the idea here today. And I do that for a reason, because obviously there are articles we could talk about, but I want to focus on book-length projects because I think they are quite significant in terms of knowledge, representations of knowledge, being symbolic of knowledge and indeed indicative of knowledge because of their, because of their extent. So the second sort of book-length project I want to think about for a moment then is called The Mad Woman and the Blind Man, which I edited with two colleagues in New York. This was my idea, so I'll say that now. I want to make sure the Vice-Chancellor knows he's done the right thing. But it would have been nothing without my two colleagues in New York. Their work on Jane Eyre was far superior to my own. But I had the idea of let's approach this famous novel from a disability studies perspective unapologetically. So the whole book does just that. So it's got 8 pretty lengthy chapters, and all of them respond to Jane Eyre in a way that is informed by disability studies. That was a really important development in terms of literary disability studies. So both of these books I've mentioned so far would fit that bill, literary disability studies. So what I'm raising here is a notion of interdisciplinarity. So disability studies is being brought together with literary studies, because that's one of the things I do want to draw together at the end. And in that same vein, then, I'll move on to the next slide. And this is just a collection of books from another project. And this project is called Literary Disability Studies, so explicitly interdisciplinary. So different subjects are being brought together. And again, we insist on having that focus on literature here, but from a disability studies perspective. And I, as you perhaps have noticed here, I went back to the same colleagues I went to in relation to The Mad Woman and the Blind Man in New York, asked them if they'd join me in proposing this book series, and they both agreed, thankfully. And now we have 7 books that have been published, and there is one in press as we speak. And I've got a sort of set of these books on the slide. I don't know, did Alex Tankard make it here? Ah, excellent. So there's lots of great stories connected with my work or my contributions to the field. And Alex in herself is a great story because she gave one of the very early sessions for the CCDS and often joined us. And I think it's okay for me to say that she was sort of not, there was a point where she started to drift away from the academy, is that fair to say? Yeah, she was having doubts, for everyone who can't hear, doubts about her future. And it would have been such a loss, a real passionate scholar. It would have been a real loss to the academy. And I just said to her, why don't you put in a proposal for this book series? It'd be right up your street. And she did, thankfully, and then she got the book, and then she got the job, etc. And it's so great, to see colleagues taking it by the horns and it working out. And this, of course, this series, I could tell stories like that about most of the books. There's lots of connections with CCDS and so on. So, as you can tell, I'm quite proud of that. Okay, moving on then. In terms of interdisciplinarity, this is obviously, it's the best thing I've done, isn't it, really? So this is the Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, yeah? And I should thank my brother here, while he's here, because I wouldn't be able to start this without my brother, because I was completely outraged with the way the academy was. Easy when you're outside the academy, you've got nothing to lose. But I didn't understand why there wasn't a journal like this. I talked to my brother, and as ever, his response was, well, why don't you sort of give it a go? And I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe. But with his IT skills and so on, we were able to get the thing up and running initially as an electronic journal only. And then it wasn't long before I was approached by publishers who wanted to be involved, which was always the plan, really. If only for the sort of legitimacy that it recognises in relation to disability studies, and specifically here, literary and cultural disability studies. So in this project now, I'm proud to say that lots of my colleagues here at Hope are involved. It's a very international project, so every time I ask a colleague here, they've got to sort of be right in the right place for me to be able to justify that involvement, as it were. And of course, over the years, that has been very much the case. So, in terms of early work of colleagues, early work of Dr. Cheen, Dr. Feeney, for example, has appeared in this journal. And I know in the case, of the ref and so on, that work has come from this direction, which again, quite proud of. In terms of special issues, the guest editors who are in this room right now, you wouldn't hardly believe, but even relatively new colleagues like Dr. Pritchard, and indeed, I'm not probably supposed to say this yet, but come on, Dr. Houston, both of them have got special issues on the horizon. Dr. Pritchard is actually on my machine, never mind on the horizon. The present issue is one that's been guest edited by Dr. Penketh. Dr. Borden is the comments editor of the journal on a general basis, as it were, but also has a special issue on the horizon, as does Anna Bay, Dr. Anna Bay. And of course, now I'm just thinking that there are others as well. Let's just say that. I know Dr. Cheen has one coming up as well, and already has one in the can, as it were, from some years ago. I'll try to make sure that I do remember everybody, but there's lots of work there that, again, is good for the university, good for us, and good for the field, I think. So note the interdisciplinarity there, then, literary and cultural disability studies. Okay, so let's move on. Yeah, so now I just want to move, so as I say, that the journal has got to be one of my proudest projects, but it's grown with and alongside in many ways the Centre for Culture and Disability Studies. I think that combination, one helps the other in many ways. And this being so, we have had more than 65 guest seminars over the last 10 years or so. And, thanks to my colleague, Dr. Borden, many of those are available on the CCDS YouTube channel. But this book was sort of invited by Routledge, have you got any books that you want to do? No, but maybe I could do one on this seminar series we've been doing, I thought. And sure enough, I pulled that together. It wasn't that easy because it wasn't really the plan originally, this one. But I'm proud to say that, again, colleagues in the room, certainly Dr. Penketh, Dr. Borden, Dr. Caslin, and Dr. Hodkinson are all in this book. And the good thing is that we actually got it translated into Korean. So there was another publication that came out of it that means the work of myself and colleagues has got that wider audience, as it were. So it's proved to be a really nice project in the end. And again, thanks to the CCDS seminars and people attending and so on, and as I said before, colleagues at Hope. So I'll move on. Again, this is another book in the same series, actually. I should stress it's not my series. People keep approaching me and asking me if it is, because I've got 3 books in it, but it's not. But I am proud to be part of it. Anyway, it's the Advances in Disability Studies by Routledge. And this is a book that I edited with Dr. Claire Penketh, who is, as you know, Head of Disability Studies here and Associate Professor in that subject. And again, this one sort of is indicative of other work we do here insofar as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned the biennial conference, and we've had 5 of those, and this was based on one of the conferences. So again, it brings together the work of colleagues alongside the work of quite well-known international figures like Peter Beresford, for example. That's just one of many examples that I could give here. And so that means that we've got that work juxtaposed with the work of, like I say, Dr. Penketh, Dr. Waite, Dr. Hodkinson, Dr. Borden. And that's, please tell me I haven't missed anyone who was here. That would be terrible. But anyway, you can see what I'm saying, that we build on work that we do here and that others bring when they visit. Okay then, we will move on. So this is a more recent project. This is not yet published, but it's on the horizon. It should be published by the end of the year, I believe. This is a 6-book project that I'm general editor with a Washington colleague, Professor Robert McCrewer, who, for those of us in the field, obviously we know him very well. He was the first person I went to ask to do this, and he was keen, and we developed the idea together. But it's basically 6 projects that, again, remember that interdisciplinarity thing that I keep going on about? Well, this brings disability studies very much with history, but also with culture. So this is a controversial text for sure, because neither Robert nor I are really historians. Robert is something of a genius, so I suppose he could put his mind to anything, but we aren't trained historians by any means, so this is going to cause trouble, as it already has a little. But what it does do, for sure, is brings disability to the centre, to think in Derridian terms. This is pushing the usual focus of history to the side in place of disability. Even we had the audacity to name impairment groups and so on, which wouldn't usually be allowed, but we did it for the right reasons, a bit like the meta-narrative of blindness. So from an informed perspective, lots of the people who are disabled academics who've written this book. And I will say, I'm quite proud to say that Dr. Borden has a chapter in the 6th one of this. Not bad company there, because it's that one's edited by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, 2 of the most important figures in the field. So I'm really pleased that Owen is involved there. Okay, well, I'll crack on, but I'll change the tone a little bit now. A lot of this has been quite descriptive. I've just been banging out examples of interdisciplinarity. And lots of the disciplines that have been mentioned, along the lines of history, culture, literature and disability studies, and education, of course. But I do want to just focus on the tripartite model for a moment here, because this brings us sort of a more conceptual aspect to the work. So this is something I put forward some time ago, and I'll give you an illustration properly in a minute. This is the thing that Claire was talking about in her session earlier on, which she did a brilliant job of, and I must admit, I did say to her, can you do mine tonight? I just, she said no. Okay then, so what I want to think about then is, yeah, we use the same T model, but the idea here is to think about disability in a more complex way than has been typical. So in the past, for those of you who are less familiar with all of this, in the past, obviously disability was thought of as a negative thing, and then it was thought of as a negative thing with some criticism. What I'm talking about is the social model. So it's a negative thing insofar as being disabled is bad, but the reason it's bad is society. And so that's got to be the most important model for the disability movement, full stop, end of. Nothing I say is challenging that, so let's be absolutely clear about that. However, other models and other ways of thinking took us down routes of, if you like, affirmation, disability gain, and things like this. So this is where disability is considered in a far more positive way. And of course, I got a real appreciation for both of these. Both of these make a lot of sense to me. But often, people are sort of in one camp or the other. That's not strictly true, of course, but that is often the way it is. If you're promoting the social model, it almost seems like you've got to do it to the expense of everything else. And again, that's not always the case, but it is sometimes. So that's really where I came in with this model, because for me, disability is a bad experience in relation to society. So the first part of this model thinks about indifference, the way society goes about its business without a care for disability, for disabled people. But then the second part of the model, for me, might think in terms of difficulties. Now, as I've thought about the model more and worked on the model more, these difficulties might be the result of society. I accept that, so you can see where I'm drawing that work from. But they also might be the result of one's embodiment, the way you are, the way we are, the way I am. So those things come into it as well. So just general difficulties about disability from within or without. But then, of course, the third element here, which we've just put, I refer to this here as qualities for ease in many ways. But this is, the wonder of the experience, the identity, the pride of being disabled. I said at the beginning, the first thing I have to mention in my family and so on, the first thing I wanted to mention was my disability, that is something on which I draw. It informs my engagement with the world, and therefore it informs my academic output, my thinking, I suppose, ultimately. So that's the model that I sketched out in, really it was sort of published in 2015, but I've been working on it since in different ways, one of which is my last book. This is listed, can you go on to the, yeah, so this book here is Cultural Disability Studies in Education. So this is where I bring 3 disciplines together, essentially, predictably, really, because I always was bringing culture and disability together. And then I found myself in a faculty of education with colleagues working in that area and started to learn from them, and then, drew on that work in this particular perspective that I put forward. So this is sort of field defining in the sense that it defines a field. I don't mean any more than that. But this very much draws on different disciplines, everything from popular music to humour studies and Holocaust studies and so on. And I tried to write that in a way that would be useful for students as well as academics who want something that they haven't read before, as it were. So probably failed on both, but maybe got somewhere on both as well. But one of the things I will mention in terms of this particular book is how I illustrated the tripartite model in relation to popular music. Now, if we go on to the next slide, Holly, and this is the picture of, a couple of pictures of a famous pop star, as it were, Freddie Mercury. There's a chapter in that book that I actually look at the work of Johnny Cash and Freddie Mercury, and there's a couple of particular videos that they did that are very powerful. They show both of these pop stars essentially at the end of their lives. Both of them died soon after the videos were made. But they are also quite incredible videos. They're really powerful because, you know, that experience is part of life. The lyrics reflect that experience and so on. I talked about this at the foundation hour that Claire invited me to do some earlier this year, I guess. So I won't open that up now, but I did enjoy doing that, actually. So the point I want to just make here is if you look at these two images, and just in case everyone can't see those, the first image is essentially of Freddie Mercury well. Let's put it like that. That's when he's well. I think it might be Live Aid. You know, he's top of his game. He's representing an aesthetic that would be described along lines of beauty and so on. The second image is taken from a video when, as I say, he's got he's dying from HIV/AIDS, essentially. The work is still amazing. So I'll just hold that thought for a moment. But those two images might just be considered along the first two parts of my model. So, you know, normative positivisms, there you've got, like I say, Freddie Mercury at Live Aid, possibly. And then the other image, the non-normative negativisms, when, you know, he's having a hard time. You know, he was finding it difficult to even stand or even, you know, the clothes were hurting him and things like that he was wearing. There's a lot of material about this. But it was a tough gig, let's put it like that. So there's the two images, but you might think, well, what about the third one then? You know, because the idea of the model is that it breaks down the binary. You know, I always allude to Derrida at some point. And that breaking down of that binary comes maybe from reconsidering that second image. Because I've said to you, that work was some of the greatest work that Freddie Mercury did. And I've also said that it was just before he died. So in terms of resilience, you know, that is a picture of resilience. So in terms of non-normative positivisms, you know, you could consider resilience as an example, and very much you know, Freddie Mercury's performance in that video, in that song, as a good illustration of what I was trying to get at with the tripartite model. So just to be absolutely clear, then the idea is that all of those things often exist together. For the experience of disability, those things coexist. Okay, well, I'll move on. I want to try to draw a bit of a conclusion here. And that's by, you know, just obviously drawing some of the things together that I've talked about. So interdisciplinarity has been one. So if we think about the tripartite model in these terms, then too often in the academy, disability just is not really on the agenda. You know, because often we work, you know, for example, you know, lots of institutions are working on old architecture, you know, that really wasn't progressed in a way that, you know, was considerate of disabled people. And of course, there are lots and lots of examples there. But if we think about the second part of the model, when it becomes more progressive, then well, actually, no, I want to just think about the second part in terms of difficulties, actually. So non-normative negativisms in the academy, that can often be, like I said before, you know, the idea of critical avoidance, you know, so that, you know, the work is not there, the disciplines are not meeting disability studies, they're being taught in ways that seem somehow devoid of relation to disability. And then the third one, of course, is what I'm trying to get at here in terms of non-normative positivisms. And that's that when you have this interdisciplinary relationship, when literary studies comes together with disability studies, you get works that are changing the face of the academy in a positive way. You know, so work that's been studied for centuries sometimes, but certainly decades. Suddenly there's new work to draw on, a whole new perspective. It's not just nuanced differences from past work, brand new perspectives that draw on disability studies first and foremost. So you can see that this is beneficial to the academy more broadly. So this is what I mean by appreciation, and that's a word that I use a lot when I move away from avoidance to appreciation. So disability is no longer framed in terms of accommodation or access, but actual appreciation. So you're recognizing what disability brings to the academy. Indeed, in the way that a disability studies scholar getting a professorship does. You know, that is part of this, and that's why I'm proud to do this. But, of course, what I've been talking about here is, you know, some people will be thinking, yeah, it's all quite academic. And of course, sometimes that is framed in that way, isn't it? That academic, you know, it's academic and therefore doesn't link to the real world. And Claire talked about this brilliantly earlier today. But one of the things that came out of the session that Claire did is, you know, that so often that lived experience is very much entangled with the so-called academic. And I will say then that the real reason for all of my work, actually, maybe is captured in this image now, so I try to challenge what I would refer to as the normative social order. Now, on these pictures here, you've got, you know, quite clearly disabled people being helped by non-disabled people. That's fine. I've got no issue with that. I'll say this, that I'm probably a disabled person in this room who is helped by more people than anyone else here. Of course, that might not be correct, but there's something in it. You know, I'm first to admit that I need help and respect and appreciate help. It's all good. What I don't appreciate is the way in which that becomes set as the only option. So what I mean by that is when people are outside the realms of appreciation. So these sort of pictures are quite easy to find. Not quite so easy to find the alternative or the deeper story, you know. So too often that notion, that what I was calling before the meta-narrative of disability, that gets taken into the home, into the workplace and so on. So if you follow that, then the disabled leaders of companies and courses and so on find it quite difficult to sort of get their due respect. You know, it's too easy to be left off lists, to be outside meetings and so on. This is the sort of things that people have told me about from around the world. This is not my anecdotal information. You know, this is lots of research that's explored these things. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to challenge with all of my work from the word go to the present. So today I've been talking about, as I say, book-length projects for the simple reason that they represent knowledge in a considered way that is actually quite difficult in the British Academy, because we're kind of encouraged to do papers first and foremost. I encourage my mentees to do that. So I'm part of the same system. But ultimately, it's those book-length projects that represent knowledge as I say, in a powerful way. And those book-length projects that have always been the most threatening. We know that there is a historical line there, you know, that might take us to Nazi Germany, the burning of books and so on. That's because they are so threatening, you know, because of that extensive knowledge base that every book can potentially contain. And of course, if you've got a problem with disability or disability studies, the idea of books, theories, and so on, and indeed knowledge that's based on disability studies is actually very difficult because it threatens that social order. So I'll just finish off by going back to what Ian Jory said, and I'll just tweak it a little bit. So read my body, as you know you will, but read my books too. Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Lavalette. I'm the Professor of Social Work and Social Policy here at Liverpool Hope, and it's my honour and privilege to be the respondent to David on the occasion of his inaugural lecture. First of all, I want to thank David because it's a very brave man that stands up here and shows a picture of yourself with a blonde mullet and black leather trousers. And I think for nothing else, he will be remembered long for that. His start off in his biography, I think, was also pertinent for myself as well, because he showed pictures of his parents on their honeymoon and said they were never there together. And I have similar pictures in my store of both my mum and dad on their honeymoon, not together but taken separately. But I have got irrevocable proof that at that they were definitely there together, because they were married on the 3rd of March 1962, and I was born on the 3rd of December 1962. So if you do the maths, they were definitely on honeymoon together. Excuse me, I'll put my glasses on. I wanted to say really that David and in fact the entire disability team have recently joined the School of Social Sciences here at the University, Liverpool Hope University. And as I've got to know both him and the team, it's been a great pleasure to start to work with them and to look at the ways in which we can embed the perspectives that he has talked about today, embed the perspectives of disability studies into our social science programmes more generally, to make sure that we are not due to undue criticism of avoidance that David spent so much time talking about. And what I suppose I wanted to think about was just the way in which disability studies itself kind of relates to some of the other social science disciplines and social work. Because disability studies is a relatively new academic discipline. I say that in a sense because it makes me feel a lot younger than I am. When I say relatively new, I'm talking about 30 to 40 years, but it makes me seem young if I say still relatively young. But it's not been in the academy like theology or English with hundreds of years behind it. And like other studies, like the women's studies or black studies, its roots were formed in the struggle of service users and activists within the disability social movements that grew out of what are often called the movements of the 1960s. In the UK, that's organisations like the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, which was formed in 1972, or the Mental Patients Union, which was formed in 1973, and both of which were there to challenge society, to challenge the norms of society, to challenge the state, to challenge the way in which discrimination was embedded within societies, but also challenge the academy, because the academies weren't thinking about disability issues or women's issues or black issues in appropriate ways. And so the movements for disability studies and women's studies and black studies have their roots in that challenge to a broader society in that way. And disability studies therefore always has both a strong theoretical discipline, but also a very clear practical and activist orientation as well. It is about challenging the present and challenging norms. It is about challenging the assumptions that too often are left unchallenged as we write our programmes, or as we form our policies, or as we go about our daily activities in whatever way we can. David started off with biography, and it brought to me the early slogan of the disability movement, which was that there should be nothing about us without us. And it seemed to me that in a very practical sense, what David is doing in his academic work is shouting that from the rooftops as an academic. There should be nothing about disabled people without listening to the voice of disabled people and disabled activists. And I think as he took us through the books and the articles, the journals and the centre and all the work that he's involved in, you could see that that was a very clear shout, a very astute academic with a clear theoretical perspective, but with a focus on making the world a better place, not just in the academic world, but a better place for people with disabilities and people who don't have disabilities in the same way. So David's lecture, I think, provided us with a great biographical trail. As I say, I'll never forget the blonde mullet. I will remind him about it often. I think it set the train in terms of how we think about disability, both in theory and in practice, and the implications of that. I certainly will be leaving here this evening thinking more about his T model and what that means in terms of the work that I do in social work or social policy, or that colleagues in other disciplines in our school do as well. It set in train a way of thinking about perhaps the ableist assumptions of the state and society within which we live, and our understandings, our deeper understandings of the world in which we are all part. So listening to David for me was a great pleasure. It was a challenge and it was an inspiration. And so formally I would like to just thank David very much for his lecture and to congratulate him on his inaugural professorial lecture.
I should have said at the beginning of our meeting today that this is the 175th anniversary of the founding of the first college of Liverpool Hope University, which goes back to 1844. And therefore, these inaugural lectures and other distinguished lectures this year are badged as celebrating our 175th. Let's go back to 1844. There were only 6 universities in England, 2 of them medieval, but all 6 of them didn't admit women, or Catholics, or Jews. And that was the England of the 1840s, when our first college is established, and a second one 2 years later, when John M.D. Newman, who was this week declared a saint, writing his famous essays in Ireland across the water. Our second was born in 1856, again a Catholic foundation. And we think of those days, and you gather from our history that in the DNA of this place, this university, is the will and the commitment to make a difference in the world. And I think if we're celebrating 175 years, David, your lecture today captures very much the vision of the university to make a difference, to be at its very best subversive of the order we are forced to live by. And so, if you wouldn't mind coming forward, David, before you go out and greet your guests at the door, there is a token we give to all our inaugural professors, which says, presented to Professor David Bolt on the occasion of his inaugural professorial lecture. The title of today's lecture is printed, but more importantly, this day, Wednesday, 16th of October, 2019. That will be remembered. So congratulations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Thank you. We'll give David a chance to make it to the door before you leave to greet you. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Good night.